It's no secret that Christianity has been a large part of Black American culture for more than 2 centuries. In an age where the Christian population is on the decline, 2/3 of us still identify as Christian, and even those who don't still have a hard time letting go of the Christian values they were raised with. To most, these facts don't mean a whole lot. Black people are religious. It is what it is. However, there is a small but growing population of people who are disgusted with the prevalence of Christianity in the Black community. For them, our love for Jesus and the church are nothing more than layovers from the brutal enslavement of our ancestors. Very few, if any, Africans brought to this country as slaves were Christian. Instead, they were stripped of their ancestral religions and forced to adopt the white man's God. Slave masters forced them to worship a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus who told them the only way to go to heaven was to obey their masters. Anyone who dared refuse to convert to the new religion was severely beaten. If the beatings weren't enough, they were killed. Eventually, self-preservation took its toll and the slaves began to practice the white man's religion. Its doctrines were drilled into their heads until they actually began to believe in the God who had been used to control them. Fast forward to today, and the religion that was brutally forced on our ancestors is now one which we willingly practice. A legacy of racism and white supremacy which most of us place right at the center of our lives. It's a sad story. It is also a lie. As surprising and even counterintuitive as it is, if one takes the time to look at the historical record, a much different story not only begins to show itself, but becomes abundantly clear. The forced conversion of American slaves to Christianity is a myth. That sentence alone comes as a shock to most people. It shocked me. But the evidence is undeniable, and I will present just some of that evidence here. Specifically, I will show 2 historical facts which completely undermine the myth of forced conversion. 1. Slave masters were actually opposed to slaves converting to Christianity. 2. Early missionary efforts to convert enslaved people were largely unsuccessful. The idea of the brutal and yet somehow still pious Christian slave masters forcing their slaves to give up their pagan gods and accept their God instead is a popular one, but one which is more prevalent in pop culture and media than actual history. In truth, slave owners, normally referred to as planters, mostly resisted the conversion of their slaves to Christianity for one simple reason. They believed if a slave became a Christian, they might have to free them. This belief is probably based on a misunderstanding of a 1670 statute which stated that all servants, not being Christians, that were shipped to the colonies were to be slaves. This was taken to mean that if a servant was a Christian, they could not be a slave. This isn't what the statute meant, but the planters weren't taking any chances on losing their investments. As scholar of African American religion Albert Roboteau writes, repeatedly, would-be missionaries to the slaves complained that slaveholders refused them permission to catechize their slaves because baptism made it necessary to free them. It took the passage of legislation declaring baptism would not grant anyone freedom for this obstacle to be overcome. But it wasn't the only reason planters did not want their slaves converted. At the time, conversion to Christianity wasn't just a matter of walking up to an altar and declaring you wanted to be saved. Conversion meant undergoing a lengthy catechism in which the catechumen, would-be convert, would be instructed in the doctrines and disciplines of the faith. It was a full-on education, one which took time that a slave could otherwise be working. For a planter who viewed a slave as little more than glorified farming equipment, allowing their slaves time off for catechism was literally costing them money. And people who were willing to reduce others to the level of cattle just to line their pockets weren't typically willing to lose money so their cattle could go to heaven. Again, Roboteau writes, even after colonial assemblies had declared baptism to be no threat to a planter's legal right to hold Africans in perpetual bondage, the process of religious instruction which had to precede baptism was seen by many slaveholders as an economic detriment. Or, as French trader Jean Barbeau noticed upon seeing the way American Protestants treated their slaves, Christians in America take very little care to have their slaves instructed. There, provided that the slaves can multiply and work hard for the benefit of their masters, most men are well satisfied without the least thoughts of using their authority and endeavors to promote the good of the souls of those poor wretches. For planters, it was all about the bottom line. But the resistance to slave conversion wasn't only about money. Here's a fun fact: slave owners were racist. While the so-called conscious individuals who oppose Black Christianity view it as a tool of white supremacy was actually another obstacle to conversion. Many modern people believe planters desired the conversion of slaves because they thought the pacifist teachings of Jesus Christ would make the slaves docile and easy to control. While these feelings would vary between individual planters, evidence suggests the popular assumption among slave owners was Christianity would make slaves uppity. The egalitarianism inherent in Christianity led planters to believe conversion to Christianity might give slaves the idea that they were equal to their masters and deserving of equal rights and freedoms. When those freedoms were denied, the slaves would rebel. And these fears were not altogether unfounded. Rebellions like that of Nat Turner and the planned revolt of Denmark Vesey, according to their perpetrators, were the will of the Christian God. In the Caribbean, where rebellions were a bit more frequent than in America, planters would drive missionaries away by force if need be. University of Minnesota historian Catherine Gerbner writes, "When Protestant missionaries arrived in the plantation colonies intending to convert enslaved Africans to Christianity in the late 1670s, they encountered slave societies that had already developed churches founded on exclusion. Planters regularly attacked missionaries, both verbally and physically, and blamed the evangelizing newcomers for slave rebellions, regardless of evidence to the contrary. And it wasn't always a fear of something as extreme as rebellion. There were many people who just could not bear the thought of Black people being able to claim equality with them in any respect." Peter Kalm, a Swede who traveled to the United States in the mid-18th century, observed, "There are even some who would be very ill-pleased at and would by all means hinder their Negroes from being instructed in the doctrines of Christianity. To this they are partly led by the conceit of it being shameful to have a spiritual brother or sister among so despicable a people." Anglican missionary Francis Lejeune even tells a story of a couple among his parishioners who reasoned that they did not want their slaves instructed because they were appalled by the idea of going to heaven and having to be there with slaves. So in spite of the myth which says planters were determined to shove Christianity down the throats of enslaved people, the truth is when it came to slave conversion, they were more of an obstacle than an asset. Now let's move on to point 2. The fact that slave owners were opposed to slave conversion by no means implies that there weren't attempts to convert enslaved people. There most certainly were attempts, but the missionaries who tried to Christianize slaves found their task much harder than they likely anticipated. We've already talked about how the planters were an obstacle, but the slaves themselves weren't exactly gung-ho about the catechism either. Native African slaves, for obvious reasons, tended to have a tenuous grasp of the English language, which would have made it difficult to grasp the doctrines being presented to them in the catechism. Or often they just didn't show up for their lessons, and one could hardly blame them. Typically, if slaves did have a day off, it was Sunday, and they usually spent the little free time they had cultivating their own plots of land, growing food to sell or supplement their meager rations given to them by their masters. If they weren't doing that, they would spend their free time socializing, dancing, playing games of chance, things that church officials often considered heathenish. Pretty much anything to get their minds off the difficult lives they live day to day. Slaves spent most of their lives doing back-breaking labor and being treated like animals. On the rare occasion when they were able to decide for themselves how they'd spend their time, memorizing the Apostles' Creed wasn't exactly a top priority. Bearing all this in mind, it's no wonder Presbyterian minister and slave conversion advocate Charles Colcock Jones wrote that by 1820, but a minority of the Negroes, and that a small one, attended regularly the house of God, and taking them as a class, their religious instruction was extensively and most seriously neglected. The fact is, we don't actually see Black Americans converting to Christianity in any significant numbers until the Great Awakening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And these conversions were by no means forced. The ecstatic nature of the revivalist meetings and emphasis on personal conversion experiences rather than catechism made it much easier to convert and be accepted into the church. That is why evangelical denominations that held these meetings, such as Baptists and Methodists, are also those which Black Americans are overwhelmingly associated with. So, if you're a Black American Christian, the next time someone tells you you're practicing a religion that was forced on your enslaved ancestors, feel free to educate them. They didn't accept Christianity because someone made them. They came to faith in Christ the same way all of us ultimately come to faith. They heard the gospel and believed.